Greetings, everyone. I'm Larry Williams from the Center for the Advancement of Research Methods and Analysis, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to another session of Meet the Methodologist. And we are particularly excited that this session is coming to you from Detroit, Michigan, and Wayne State University, where I joined the faculty January 4th, and which is now the new main home of CARMA. Our speaker today that you're going to get the chance to chat with is Dr. Robert Wiseman, who's made the trip over from East Lansing and Michigan State University. And his webcast lecture today is on the use of ratio measures. And so Bob, welcome to CARMA, welcome to Wayne State University, and we appreciate you taking your time from your busy schedule to join us.
I'm glad to be here.
So just going to start out with a general question about how you got interested in research methods and particularly the topic that you're going to be talking about later today.
Well, I always had an interest in methods because I always thought that was the primary background of whatever we do as a scholar. But one of the things that really sort of motivated this more recent look into methods was coming to Michigan State University, which is a very methods-oriented group of people. And that was actually one of the reasons why I accepted the offer to come to Michigan State, is because I knew I was going to be surrounded by people who were very focused on making sure that the methods were right, and it rubbed off. So it was really coming there that prompted this look at this particular topic.
Uh-huh. And did you have a particularly favorite research methods course that you took as a graduate student? And if so, why that particular one?
Yeah, I think it would probably be, I was at the University of Minnesota, and Jeff Maruyama taught a course in structural equation modeling.
Uh-huh.
And I thought it was a very interesting course, partly because it was not only trying to understand the background behind the methods, but it was also very applied in the sense that he would have us find articles in our own field and then decide that we're using this methodology and then dissect them. And we were finding articles that were published in top journals that were violating various principles. That was fun to say, okay, well, they still didn't do it right.
Yeah. And as best you can recall, were there any particular challenges you faced in learning about research methods or quantitative methods as a graduate student?
Well, it is always a bit of a challenge. I mean, I was always good in math, so the math didn't scare me. But depending on, I had an econometrics course while I was at Minnesota as well, and mostly what they do there is it's a lot of proofs to show how these things work, and it was easy to follow where the proof was, but my challenge was to try to get in ahead of the instructor to see where he was going with this proof. I figured if I could figure out where he was going before he got there, then I really understood what he was doing, and that was the challenge for me. It was not simply to follow what he was doing, but to understand where the end was before he got there.
Well, since your graduate students' days, you've obviously had a lot of success as a scholar, and I'm sure that you have a lot of experience as a reviewer for substantive papers in the area of strategy, which is the area that Bob works in. So I'm wondering, given those experiences as a reviewer, whether you could comment on what you think are some of the most frequent limitations or shortcomings of papers that you have reviewed, both in terms of the limits of their theory or the limits of their research methods and data analysis.
Well, there's clearly some shortcomings. I mean, most of the people doing the work in strategy, many of them I should say, would have fairly good training in econometrics, and because we do a lot of time series analysis there, and less training in more of a psychometric approach. And I've had training on both sides of this, so I have some appreciation at least for both the estimation issues that econometrics brings and some of the issues about measurement that psychometrics brings. And I would say that in the strategy side, we by and large have less of an appreciation for the psychometric side. They're just not as attuned to measurement issues that, let's say, people in organizational behavior or HR or IO psychology have. And that's probably the biggest issue. And in fact, I would point to some other articles, people by Mike Hitt and Brian Boyd, who've pointed this out, and I would echo their statements that we have failed largely to appreciate some of these issues in terms of how we measure things and what we understand about the things that we're measuring, how we describe them.
And do you have a favorite methods book that either influenced you greatly earlier in your career, or one that you rely upon regularly, and if so, why that particular one?
The one, I'm not sure that I have one that really influenced me greatly. I mean, I read quite a few books during my days, but that was so long ago, I don't know if I have that deep a memory. But the one that I tend to rely on quite a bit for just sort of basic things is a book by Aiken and West on multiple regression. It's a nice, very clean, very clear description, and goes into some detail about interaction effects and modeling effects and higher order effects. And I tend to pull that one off the shelf every once in a while just to remind myself on when I'm looking at some complex relationships and that. So,
yeah. From sort of a big picture perspective, are there topical areas within the fields of research methods as they relate to strategy that you think that we do a particularly good or bad job of investigating? So I'm kind of interested in your take on the research methods work related to strategy, and maybe what's the good part of that literature, and maybe where some areas where we should be focusing more.
Well, as I said before, I think we don't focus enough on understanding how we measure things. I mean, we take for granted, for example, return on assets, which has been used almost in every strategy article you read. Very few people really know what that's supposed to mean, and there's so many different ways of actually measuring return on assets, or return on turnover if you're in Europe. And they don't even tell you how they measured it. What forms of income did they use? What forms of how they measure the assets and things like that. And so that's a deficiency. But beyond that, the biggest problem in methods and strategy is that there's very few places to publish anything on methods in work and strategy. I mean, the only journal that probably would be sort of accepting of this is, the Journal on Organizational Research Methods, which is still pretty much dominated by micro side. And I'm not sure how many people on the macro side read it. I mean, if you look at the membership of the Research Methods Division in the Academy of Management, it's still pretty much dominated by people who have a membership in OB or HR. Very few members are members of BPS, Business Policy and Strategy. And so the real problem here for strategy research is that we tend not to publish things that sort of explore how to rethink our methods, whether it's a measurement issue, whether it's an estimation issue.
Well, I think I certainly in my experience as an editor for ORM, I welcomed the macro papers. We certainly got less of them over time, and I think that they're under Herman McGinnis and most recently Bob Vandenberg, there have been some featured topics that have dealt with macro topics. But I think that everyone would hope that the strategy folks would come to see that as their top methods outlet, just as the micro people do as well. Bob, you probably know that a big audience of CARMA's programs and their events are doctoral students, and one of the reasons that I like to have these kind of sessions is to give accomplished people like yourself the opportunity to share their advice to graduate students who are wanting to have a successful career as a researcher. So do you have any particular advice that you would give to those students about things that they can do that will increase their success as a scholar as they move forward in their career?
Well, I think you want to have as many tools in your toolkit when you're coming out of a PhD program as you can, and by tools I mean tools and research methods. And so I think you do want to, especially if you're talking to strategy scholars, I think you want to, obviously you want to do an econometric sequence because most of our research is time series related, and you want to have strong skills in that area. but I think you also want to look at the tools that are used out over on the micro side, which is you want to understand measurement issues, psychometric issues, and that. And the more tools that you can build coming out of a program, they're going to carry you a lot longer, more so than the content area. There's the content area is going to continue to change and evolve, and it's a starting point for your research. And hopefully you're going to be involved in changing that content over time. But the primary tools you have to change and contribute to the content side are the research method side.
Yeah.
And so I would say focus a lot on that. And also understand the philosophies underneath science too, to understand where these tools come from and why we use them the way we use them.
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, you're here with us today to give a CARMA webcast lecture that's offered as part of our CARMA Consortium webcast program on the use of ratio measures. And I was wondering if you could describe kind of the origins of this work and kind of a summary of the chapter that's the basis of your presentation today.
Well, the origin is in many cases of some of my research, it was serendipitous. I, like most every other strategy scholar, took ratios for granted. We just use return on assets for everything, and we use things like Tobin's Q, and we ratio everything. Mostly just to control for size effects, because there's vast differences in the size of firms, and we're using accounting level data. In Cohen and Cohen's '83 textbook, they caution against the use of ratios, building off of a paper that was written back in 1897 by Pearson, who said ratios create spurious associations. And Cohen extended on that and cautioned. John Hollenbeck, who's a professor in our department, teaches a research methods course, uses that textbook, knows that chapter, and mentioned it to me. He said, "Why do you people always use ratios? I'm using this textbook, and they say it's not a good thing, basically." He says, "You really ought to look into this." And so I did. And the more I looked into it, the more I started to see there are some major issues here, and there has been about an 80-year debate that has gone on pretty much outside of the area of management, and even largely outside of psychology even, about the use of ratio measures. It's occurred in sociology because they use a lot of ratios. It's occurred in economics, it's occurred in biology, and it took me 3 years to write this chapter because it was a process of trying to understand and pull together all these different perspectives on whether ratios should or should not be used. And the issue comes down to a debate between specification and estimation. The advocates of ratio measures are basically arguing from a notion of specification, saying, well, if the theory suggests that the theoretical construct calls for a ratio as the best way to measure it, then that's what you have to use. Otherwise, you're not testing the theory. It's a valid argument. On the other side of the debate are the people who advocate from a position of estimation, saying, but when you do use ratios in a model, we have found consistent evidence that they create spurious or biased or inconsistent or unstable relationships with other variables, whether it's another ratio or even a constant, a single measure. And so now we have, well, what should we do? The theory says we should do this, but the estimation models say, well, yeah, but it could lead to spurious associations. And that's what sort of went back and forth for this long period of time as both sides marshaled evidence for and against ratios. And in the end, the estimate side won the argument. That, yes, we have to be careful about making sure that we respond to the theory, but we sometimes ask more of theory than it can deliver. And we also have to think about, is there alternative ways of satisfying the theory and yet making sure that we aren't creating spurious associations or biasing the results that we get. And there are some solutions to that, which in my chapter I try to point out, okay, here are some ways to respond to this. Because not all ratios are theoretical constructs. They are simply expedient ways of dealing with things like heteroscedastic error terms or nonlinearity or non-normality in the data. Well, there's other ways of dealing with that besides creating a ratio, and without then departing too much from what the theory is suggesting we ought to be testing. So that's the genesis of this chapter and sort of what it's trying to argue.
Okay, and where is it published?
It's published in the Advances in Research Methods in Strategy and Management, Volume 5, authored by Dave Ketchen and Don Berg.
Okay. Bob, I'd like to close kind of with a couple of more personal types of questions. And as I talk to accomplished people like yourself, I'm always kind of intrigued by the different things that people do that inspire them and that motivate them. And I'm wondering whether you do anything special to draw inspiration or motivation for your work.
I don't know. I like writing. And I would say that the toughest thing I have to do is when I have an idea of something I want to do and trying to put together that first initial argument to try to explain that. That's the hardest part. But once I get started on that, then it's a lot of fun, and I just keep going with it.
Yeah.
And I like to debate with someone, whether it's an imaginary counterpart that I'm arguing with that sort of represents the establishment of the views, the current thinking, and I can argue against that in some way. But
yeah, I think your point about the early stages of writing as being sort of the most painful part. Do you have anything when you're at that particular stage and you're struggling a bit that you can rely on that sort of helps you get through?
Coffee and donuts.
Coffee and donuts.
Yeah, I find sugar and caffeine; those two things really help.
Okay.
And I don't, and I might end up rewriting it all, but at least I can get something on paper that allows me to react to that and start editing and fixing. But
yeah.
Coffee and sugar works for me.
Well, the final question that we'll close with is I'm interested in your favorite and the least favorite parts of your work. I might guess that the coffee and the donuts sort of move towards the top, but just in terms of the wide array of things that you do in your various roles that you're in, what are the things that you like the best and the least?
In terms of writing, actually the best thing I like is responding to reviewer comments. Believe it or not, I mean, I really, because now I have a conversation with someone, and I have things to react to, and I can formulate arguments to specific points. When you're writing the paper, you're trying to anticipate what they might be, and so it's a little vague and it's a little bit more difficult. So I do really like responding to reviewer comments and have a lot of fun with that. Probably the other, I think sometimes the editing part is always, that's not fun, and sometimes just estimating models again and again and manipulating fine parts, it gets kind of boring after a while. But when you get good results, then it's exciting again. So,
yep.
So.
When the data shares your enthusiasm for the hypotheses, right. As I like to say.
Yes, right. So then it becomes fun, and I would say also working with doctoral students, because most of the work we do over at Michigan State is with doctoral students, and seeing them really start to grasp what's going on and to really understand the process and get to the point where they're no longer following you, but they're at least abreast or maybe even leading you in the process of modeling and dealing with writing the paper, and that's a great thrill.
Yeah. Well, it's also a great thrill to be have finally made the transition and have CARMA here at Wayne State University, and we're very excited to have you not only participating in the Meet the Methodologist interview, but our upcoming webcast lecture this afternoon. For those of you that may be less familiar with CARMA, or the Center for the Advancement of Research Methods and Analysis, we invite you to visit our website and learn more about the kinds of things we do. So, Bob, thanks again for joining us,
Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this session. Have a good day.